So in peacocks, says evolutionary perspectives on intimate relationships, so in human beings. Sexual selection should have absolutely operated in human beings as well, such that whatever traits, preferences, tendencies contributed to successful reproduction that results in surviving offspring, whatever those preferences are that contribute to successful reproduction, those should be passed down. And, therefore, us human beings should be the products of generation upon generation of sexual selection. Therefore, our preferences, when it comes to sex, when it comes to mate selection, they're not just random, but rather they are strategic. They are things that we as a human species evolved to solve reproductive problems that we faced when the human species was evolving. Now, biological types have looked at this and said, well, maybe that explains a lot of things about human physiology, about the way that we respond sexually. But the evolutionary psychologists focus specifically on the evolution of what's called psychological mechanisms. A psychological mechanism is a tendency to think and respond a certain way in the presence of certain stimuli. Now, the word mechanism makes this sound very robotic. We don't like the idea that, I'm not a mechanism. I have free will. I respond flexibly to things. Well, the evolutionary psychologists don't really mean that this is a deterministic mechanism. But they ask a question. The evolutionary psychologists ask a question, which is this. Why do we find youth attractive? Why? Why are people who are sort of young and have good, clean skin, why is that attractive? Now you might say, well, obviously it's attractive. It's more attractive to have, like for example, evolutionary psychology, I'll get you in a second. Evolutionary psychologists ask this question. Why is clean skin sexier than oozing, festering sores? Well, you're laughing because like, obviously, no one wants a big pussy oozing sore for a partner. But why? Exactly why? Maybe it seems obvious, but why? Well, the evolutionary psychologist says, back in evolutionary times, let's say there were two cavemen. One of them really loved oozing, festering sores. And the other one really loved clean, fresh skin. Well, it so happens that people who have clean, fresh skin tend to be healthier. They're more likely to reproduce successfully. So that preference for clean, fresh skin was more likely to lead to successful reproduction, whereas the guy who was only reproducing with the people with oozing, festering sores, well, those kids didn't survive very long. So we evolved a preference for youth, for health, for fresh, clean skin. Do you have a question? What's your name? Luigi. Luigi. Absolutely. Absolutely. So the idea being that, well, let's say there's two cavemen, and one of them really likes people who are sort of old and wizened. And the other one likes people who are young and just coincidentally at reproductive age. Well, that person who's attracted to young people of reproductive age is going to reproduce more often and more successfully. So the preference will get passed down. Now, a psychological mechanism the idea is that a psychological mechanism gets passed down across generations in the same way that brown hair gets passed down across generations, or tallness, or straight teeth. Now, we're closer to identifying the genes for straight teeth than we are to identify the gene for preferring a particular mate over another particular mate. And that's okay. The evolutionary psychologist says, I'm not sure what the gene is for a particular psychological mechanism. All I can tell you is there is a psychological mechanism, which in this case would be a preference for a certain kind of mate over another kind, and it gets passed down. Or it got passed down, and now that's what we're left with. What they are is preferences, tendencies in the human species, What they're not is deterministic or mechanistic. Here's another thing that they're not necessarily. Psychological mechanisms are not necessarily conscious. Well, maybe they are conscious, and that is, I think none of you it's quite conscious that, yeah, I prefer no festering sores, please. Most people prefer straight teeth over crooked teeth. Most people prefer signs of health than signs of sickness. Well, that's conscious. And the evolutionary psychologist says that's a psychological mechanism. That preference is a psychological mechanism, and it serves an adaptive function. It means that we're going to seek out mates that are maximally likely to help us reproduce successfully. Now, here's the interesting thing. Evolution takes a long time to work itself out. A long time. Changes evolve in a species, let's say the human species, slowly, mighty slowly. And the implication of that fact is that in terms of evolutionary history, it's been an eye blink since we were all wearing skins, living in caves with a lot more hair on our bodies and thick ridges over our eyebrows. From an evolutionary perspective, it was just yesterday that we were all Neanderthals. And if that's true, says the evolutionary psychologist, and if we in fact have evolved psychological mechanisms, then these evolved psychological mechanisms did not evolve to adapt us to today's environment, because, in evolutionary terms, today's environment has barely started to exist. No. We have evolved not to adapt to this environment of UCLA, but rather to adapt to the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. In other words, we've adapted our mechanisms to fit the environment where we all evolved from, in caves with wearing saber-toothed tiger skins. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the flavor of it. So the evolutionary psychologist is making a very interesting point, which is that with respect to our psychological mechanisms, we are all cave people. Therefore, if you want to understand our current day's psychological mechanisms, if you want to understand how the human species evolved, what preferences the human species has, then you don't want to look at today. You want to look at history. You want to look at the environment of evolutionary adaptedness and ask yourself, what preferences would have evolved in that environment? What was adaptive back then? And that's how evolutionary psychology proceeds. Evolutionary psychology proceeds basically by conducting, at first, thought experiments. Saying, okay, let's think about it. What was that environment like? What were the adaptive challenges that the human species had to respond to? And what would have been a strategic, clever way to pass on your genes? It's likely that we would have evolved psychological mechanisms that are responsive to those challenges. And since no time has passed at all since then, we're going to still have those psychological mechanisms. Mechanisms that are adapted to that environment, the environment of 30, 40,000 years ago. You with me so far? Then let's think about it. What were the challenges? What were the challenges that human beings faced with respect to reproduction and mate selection in that environment? Well, there's actually a sub-theory of evolutionary theory that addresses this exact question. And that theory is called the theory of parental investment. And the theory of parental investment does what I just described. It thinks back and says, okay, there we are, we're all living in caves. What's the challenge? What's the issue? And the theory of parental investment says a lot of the challenges around human reproduction and mate selection arise from this fact, the fact that by virtue of biology, men and women invest in the next generation in different ways. And I can tell you I'm experiencing this right now in my house. The theory of parental investment says, let's take a look at the situation and adaptive challenges that women face. A woman, unlike a female dog or some female fish, can only gestate, most of the time, one child at a time. Fish can have plenty of eggs at the same time. A female dog can have a litter of puppies. Human beings, except for that crazy lady that lives nearby, most of the time, one, maybe two. Most of the time, one baby at a time. And how long does it take to nurture that baby? 9 months! And during that 9 months, that woman is increasingly immobile and cannot gestate other children. She can take care of existing children, but she cannot gestate other children. So for 9 months, your reproductive capacity is tied up into one single child. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, your goal, if you're the mother of that child, is support this child. And how are you going to do it? Well, you want to try to find a mate that will, A, be healthy and fit, so that this child's likely to be healthy and fit. B, you want a mate that can protect your child from predators. And C, you want a mate who's going to help you with this child even after the child comes out. So, if you have two cave women with different preferences, the one who reproduces the most successfully is the one who has the preferences that attract her towards mates that solve those problems. So, what would you expect? You would expect over the course of generations for females of the species to evolve psychological mechanisms that alert them to the presence of men who are healthy, men who are strong, men who have the capacity to protect the mother and the child. What about men and the same environment of evolutionary adaptiveness? What are men's challenges? Men's challenges are quite different because their investment in parenthood is different. A man's investment in creating an offspring is sperm. And men have plenty of sperm. Moreover, whereas a woman can only be impregnated once for 9 months at a time, a man can impregnate many, many people simultaneously with very little effort. In fact, even by accident. So men, what are men looking for? Well, for men, the challenge is to get access to as many people as possible, because the more people I have access to, the more genes I'll have passed down. So if you've got two cavemen, and one of them says, I'm really not that interested in sex. And one of them says, yes, I'm extremely interested in sex, and I want to have sex with as many people as possible. Which one's going to have more offspring and pass down their preferences? The one who's deeply interested in sex. So, evolutionary psychology says, men should have evolved over countless generations psychological mechanisms that alert them to sexual availability in partners. They should alert them to, they should have mechanisms that make them highly desirous of sex. And that should alert them to fertility, if possible, or at least availability